But I also think surrealism perhaps speaks to Gen Z because, especially Plato's Timaeus, maybe it started with David Lynch, this language is actually ultimately boring. Recently, I was introduced to the idea of pursuing the kind of work which leaves imaginative resources left over for your creative endeavors, for your own life force. So I had never considered imagination as a sort of resource. The more I thought about it, I realized I wanted strategies for reclaiming imagination. My mind wandered to the practices of surrealism. Recently, I've seen a lot of discourse online about whimsy, and I wonder if it comes from a similar crisis, a sense that our imagination is drained, threatened by the attention economy. At the same time, I was noticing that surrealism, a type of artistic expression I've loved for years, was having a resurgence. So I've been off Instagram for a while now. It was more of a I'm scared to be perceived in this period of cocooning and shedding than I'm trying for righteous reasons to correct my brain. But nonetheless, I've reaped some benefits until recently when I decided to get back on the platform so that I could have access to my local bakery's menu and other business and social event posters and flyers and such. And as these platforms are designed, that intended use hasn't always been the only use. And recently I found myself in a very odd rabbit hole, as one does, and I discovered photos of me from when I was a small child in the ballet world. I danced for about 12 years, and when I gave it up, I didn't really think much about it, but seeing these pictures reminded me of the awe and wonder that came with the kind of artistic expression. It's non-linguistic, and it's expressed in silence and music and posture. And for some reason, this really called to mind for me the discussion at the beginning of The Argonauts by Maggie, where she talks about having been a student of Wittgenstein's theory that the inexpressible is contained inexpressibly in what is expressed. Say that 3 times fast. She also talks about this when discussing an Anne Carson interview where instead of answering those personal questions or process questions or boring questions, she just inserts brackets. Nelson says the brackets seem to make a fetish of the unsaid rather than simply letting it be contained in the sayable. I've always been entranced by the idea of inexpressibility as a topos in literature, as a way to describe emotional experiences which venture off into extremity, or as a means of describing what Kant and others might call the sublime. And when I saw these old pictures, I just found myself wondering whether this could be traced in some small way to the little ballerina in me who extracted such meaning and such depth from the arrangement of bodies in space. And this all, for some reason, reminded me of Judith Butler's Bodies That Matter. And forgive me for this quick summary because it's going to be more playful than scholarly and accurate. Judith Butler's Bodies That Matter does an intellectual history of the concept of matter, and specifically the opposition of matter and meaning. And the book focuses this intellectual historicization on especially Plato's Timaeus and the concept of the receptacle. And so part of Butler's argument, as I remember it, is that there's often an overlap between what is feminine and what is considered materiality. And also the idea that the receptacle in the Timaeus is posited as something that falls outside of the metaphysical world order, but that gives that world order being. However, Plato is able to discuss the attributes and talk about and name the receptacle. And so Butler partially uses that point to claim that metaphysical exclusions are generally constituted and enforced through the very systems, the very language that they're said to fall outside of. Pivots to French psychoanalytic feminist responses to the receptacle, specifically looks at Irigary's miming of the Platonic discourse to claim that the maternal feminine chora receptacle that falls outside of the system actually can be a site of infiltration, explosion, and empowerment for women. But also Christeva's sense that the semiotic realm, that which comes before the symbolic, wherein lies all language and representation, can be something empowering. And I suppose it just reminded me of the conversation at hand, because I wonder, when I give ground to silence and inexpressibility, do I cede some chance to push deeper into naming and form and creation and the translatability of my experience in the name of a feeling of boundedness that makes me feel secure? I heard a professor say that it wasn't enough to say, I can't tell you any more about this piece that moved me, just know that it made me cry so much. She suggested that to describe art or to describe an emotional experience with this language is actually ultimately boring. It isn't able to carry the meaning that you experienced into the viewer or transmute it or alchemize it. In fact, it's actually just throwing in the towel. So I find myself trying to push past what easily comes to mind as an inexpressibility and search for language that, even if it cannot perfectly capture, might make it new, make it something I can give to others. So I've always been a really big fan of surrealism. Maybe it started with David Lynch films in high school, or maybe it could be traced back to dance. But I also think surrealism perhaps speaks to Gen Z because our perception is totally shaped, molded by the internet, by our different encounters with new kinds of technology. I feel like every other day I'm growing a new digital sense organ, or my experience of the world outside of my devices is molded, adjusted in some way to reflect my life online, which is perhaps just a me problem and I need to spend less time on the internet. That could definitely be true. And I was thinking about surrealism a lot recently because I was at the Art Institute in Chicago, and they're doing or at least when I visited, they were doing a symbolist art exhibit, and I'd seen representations of Judith and Holofernes, and I'm sorry if I'm not saying that right, in several different art styles throughout the years, but seeing the symbolist Art Nouveau representation of this woman carrying his head, oh my gosh, it was incredible. And also just some of the images that I'll pop up here made me feel as if I were in a dream or a nightmare that I wanted to escape, but also wanted to never forget. It was incredible. And so this got me thinking about some of my favorite women surrealists. And immediately who came to mind was Leonara Carrington, whose short stories I love, whose novel, The Hearing Trumpet, is an incredible journey quest featuring old women, ice ages, mushrooms, all the good stuff. And what I love about Carrington's art is the way you get the sense that she's crafted her own personal mythology with a little bit of Celtic lore, with a little bit of Catholicism, a little bit of tarot, and she's meshed all these references she's encountered out into the world into something that gives her life such richness and depth. And in her stories, where it's like hitting you with these loaded, wacky, bizarre images, it feels like she's reaching out, encouraging you to make your own codex of the things that make your life feel magical or mystical. And I also really admired the way it seemed she lived her life. There were these stories that, she might put mustard on her shoes just randomly, or that she would serve up tapioca dyed with squid ink and call it caviar, which I would like to try that. And she also had this really incredible friendship with another surrealist, Remedios Varo, who she actually loved to cook with. So when I was thinking about how to become more Carrington-like, I tried to pay more attention to my cooking routines and let them be a little bit more bizarre. So I ate sort of like a child would. I had some tapioca pudding inspired by her, and I was cooking some onions when I noticed they almost looked like worms jumping in the oil, and so I leaned into this and played around with it a little bit. I also recently learned about Suzanne Césaire, the wife of Aimé Césaire, who I know from his incredible post-colonial reinterpretation of Shakespeare's The Tempest, but I didn't know she was a writer in her own right, which, dang, I wish I had before. And she really admired the Surrealist movement and thought it could be a source of strength and empowerment, and so I'm excited to read more of her. And then I also was thinking of some figures who I think have surrealist tendencies, even if they weren't necessarily entrenched in the historical movement in France. So I thought of Deren, the avant-garde American filmmaker whose films take a single moment of perhaps sometimes a quotidian moment in life, and they fold that moment inside of itself, allow for recurrence and repetition and undoing. And I just find that the costuming, the spaciousness, allow for the viewer to be sort of transported into a dream world. And then lastly, I thought of Anna Mendieta, who's a more contemporary artist who tragically died, and I thought about her Silhouette series, and perhaps because of the Carrington that informs so much of my opinion on surrealism, I'm so struck by the animism in Mendieta's corpus, and especially in the Silhouette series, and so I tried to emulate this series. Nature is already full of form, and to craft something that mirrors my own sense of spatiality or embodiment, and to merge it with the form that exists all around me, out of my control, and out of my design, provides a chance for reflecting on the intricacies of living in a body that you know but also don't know. I can't tell what's going on inside my cells, for example, and living in a mind that wants to be here but also is able to be aware of consciousness in a way that perhaps wants to escape the very bounds it is tied to. So on that cheerful note, the quest for whimsy seems to speak to a desire to imbue daily life with mysticism, and the resurgent care for surrealism speaks to a need for defamiliarizing modes of perception in a time where attention is so thoroughly exploited and perhaps even desecrated.